book that I translated. It's actually going to be published next fall by Cornell University Press, so I'm really, really excited about that. Yeah.
Is it an older Yiddish book, or?
So it was written in 1979, and it's a memoir. It's about a Polish Jewish leftist activist who was infatuated with the Soviet Union and with the Soviet dream. And she came to the Soviet Union illegally in 1923, taught Yiddish in Azerbaijan, like she was a real enthusiast. And then she was arrested in 1937, spent 10 years in the Gulag, and 20 years in internal exile in the Soviet Union, and eventually made it to Israel. So yeah, this is about her life, and it's a fascinating portrait of Jews in the Soviet Union, and something we often don't think about, how involved they were in the whole Soviet project.
So just to mention, when I was listening to our author's video, she mentioned another book, Grey Bees, and she said that one won for the translation. So
exactly, and the guy who translated Grey Bees was my mentor when I was at the Yiddish Book Center, so small world.
So maybe we'll see for you.
So I feel like I've been here before, and I actually presented Grey Bees to you guys. Was anybody here?
Which one?
Grey Bees.
Yes.
Yes, that was me.
Mm-hmm. You did.
We've met.
Okay. She's just closing the door. Sometimes our concierge is there, right?
Go ahead, Anisha.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be talking with you about a book that I find absolutely fascinating. This is not an easy read, but I think it's a book for our time, because one of the big questions that the book asks is, what is the role of literature in the face of atrocity? Like, in the face of war, what role does fiction serve? What role do stories serve? And also, it asks the question of, what does it mean to watch a war unfold from the comfort of our own home? And I think that's something probably a lot of us can relate to at this point, whether we're thinking about what's happening in Israel or what's happening in Ukraine or other places in the world. But the author feels a certain amount of sort of survivor guilt, because she's in Vancouver in the comfort of her own home. Meanwhile, her relatives are being bombed in Ukraine. And what right does she have to be so comfortable, and when all she can do is tell stories? So she interrogates some of those questions, which I think are very interesting and very, very timely. So just a little bit about the author. Maria Riva was born in 1989. She was born in Ukraine, and now she lives in BC. She lives just outside of Vancouver in New Westminster. She writes fiction, and she also writes opera libretti. So, like opera scores. Her sister is a very famous Canadian composer, and the two of them often work together. So she writes the words to the operas, and her sister writes the music. And this book has had quite a lot of success. It was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. It was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award in Canada, and it won the Writers' Trust Fiction Prize just a month ago. This is Maria Riva's second book. She wrote a book of short stories. It was published during the pandemic in 2020, and the collection is called Good Citizens Need Not Fear. And that book it's a collection of linked short stories. It's set in Ukraine, and it's set in an apartment block as the Soviet Union is crumbling. And it's also set, so it's kind of like set in the early 90s, and also it flashes forward to post-Soviet times as well. And what's interesting is there's an illustration in this book, which I'm not sure that the audio people got to see, or I'm not sure how they talked about this illustration. Hold on, there's an illustration of crumbling apartment buildings right here, right before part 2.
Oh, yeah.
And this illustration is from her first book. This is the apartment complex that she writes about in Good Citizens Need Not Fear. And what happened in Good Citizens Need Not Fear is that, the building wasn't built well, and so initially it just crumbled in itself. And the irony is that she wrote that well before the war in Ukraine, but as she is sitting in Vancouver and watching the news, she starts to see apartments just like this in Ukraine being bombed, so crumbling for a very different reason. And it's almost like fact and fiction kind of collide in her world. And that's what she also tries to tease apart in this novel. How do, what is the relationship between fact and fiction? And part of what makes this novel both so fascinating and so hard to read is that the author enters the book at a certain point. We start off reading about snails and about the romance tour industry in Ukraine, and it feels very much like a satire for the first 100 pages, and then suddenly there's an explosion, and as readers, we know that that's the war, right? The war in Ukraine is starting. And after that explosion, it's almost like the fabric of the novel breaks apart. Because as she was writing this novel, she didn't know what to do when the war started, when the chaos, the war seeped in. And as a writer, she thought, what am I doing writing about the stupid romance industry in Ukraine when my relatives are dying? Like, what am I doing? And for a while, she actually quit this novel completely and wrote a different novel about like gun control in the United States. And she refers to that novel too. And that was sort of her escapist novel because she was trying to escape the horrors of what her family was going through. And then she gave it to her agent, and her agent was like, this isn't a novel. This is just a series of little yurts. And that is why in this novel we get these dialogues between the author and the yurt makers. And the yurt makers are kind of like, like a Greek chorus. A Greek chorus that sort of knows everything and that comments on what is happening. And here, the yurt makers, they set the author straight. When Maria Reva, the author, is writing something that doesn't quite make sense, they're like, you shouldn't have said that. Because at one point she said, all Soviet apartment blocks look identical. And then when she's talking to the yurt makers, they're like, actually, no, they don't look identical. You are falling into the trap of stereotyping Soviet apartment blocks. And she was like, oh, okay. So this novel is also about the process of learning to write a novel. So there's a lot of sort of meta fiction, in other words, fiction about fiction. And the author is kind of playing tricks with us a little bit because she introduces us to her avatar, right? There's this woman named Maria, or Masha, who runs the romance tour company, Romeo and Julia. And she's a lot like the author, Maria Reva, but she isn't Maria Reva, obviously, because Maria Reva does not run a romance tour company from her house in Westminster, but they do share certain attributes, like they're both writers, they're both concerned with stories, and they are both desperately trying to get her grandfather, out of Kherson. So this is a novel about being in diaspora, about the diasporic experience. It's a novel about the people who stay, who choose to stay in a war-torn country, and the people who leave. And some of the choices of staying and leaving are very obvious, and some are much more problematic, like the grandfather who refuses to leave Kherson, even though the city is being bombed from all sides. And in real life, Maria Reva's grandfather is still in Kherson. Her entire family has left Ukraine. Some are in Slovenia, some are in Berlin, some are in Canada. They're refugees, right? But her grandfather is the one family member who has absolutely, adamantly refused to go. And I mean, part of it is he has a lot of health trouble. He's 88 years old at this point. And I was listening to an interview with her, and she said, you know, when a person is 88 years old and their body is falling apart, that is a much greater horror than what's happening outside the window, right? Like the war outside doesn't compare to the horrors of being ill and having your own body decay. So he is there. He has not read this novel. And in a way, this whole novel is a way